Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to speak at this workshop. My background is in literary studies, but I'm very much a literary humanist by practice, and the age will be, to a large extent, the focus of this talk. I'll be touching on a number of digital projects that I've conducted over the years, but I thought for the more informal setting of this workshop, I would focus on a project that is still very much in active development and open for input and collaboration. And that project is the Romantic Period Poetry Archive, or RAPPA for short. So as you can see, RAPPA is situated towards the tail end of the long 18th century, but I hope that by focusing in this talk on the conceptual and methodological underpinnings of the project, potential applications might still suggest themselves to participants and will hopefully be useful in the context of this workshop. So I'll be talking briefly about the motivation, the aims, and the corpora that are assembled in RAPPA, and then I'll outline the comparative nature of the project, in particular the concept of contextuality within the project. After that, I'll move on to discussing the approaches taken in the project, which will largely focus on multilingual DH and semantic web technologies, and I'll conclude with an outlook on our digital platform for the project and some future work. The idea for this project was nascent really in a small DH project I conducted in 2018, where I looked into translations of Thomas Gray's famous elegy written in a country churchyard. Gray's elegy is one of the most widely and frequently translated, paraphrased, and imitated poems in the English language, with to date at least 266 translations into at least 40 languages. The elegy has inspired translators since the early 1760s, when the earliest Latin translations appeared. Since then, the poem has been influential in the history of many national literatures, particularly in the context of the development of European Romanticism. The aim of the Gray's Elegy in Translation project was to make it possible to trace and document the reception and impact of Gray's most famous poem in a number of languages and national literatures. Drawing on the extensive collection of elegy translations compiled by Tom Turk, the purpose of this work is firstly to enable the study of the evolution of translations of the poem in a single language, and secondly to allow for a comparative study of the translations across languages and literatures. The translations, as I hope the project showed, variably highlight changes in the interpretation of the original, reflect cultural borrowings and transfers, betray changes in literary taste, and may even allow us to uncover the circumstances, agency, and purpose of their production. From this earlier experiment, which is actually still ongoing, it wasn't really a huge step to think this idea in the bigger context of Romanticism, which led to the project I want to focus on today. So what is RAPPA? RAPPA is a new open access digital platform for global Romantic period poetry. Global here in the sense of Felicity Nussbaum's concept of critical global studies, first introduced in her edited collection, The Global 18th Century, namely as a spatially and conceptually expanded paradigm in which dialogue and exchange rather than influence and perception are the dominant categories. Of course, European Romanticism still plays a major role in this setting, and there's no attempt to downplay the role of poetry in shaping national identities, but the focus of RAPPA is to conceptualize Romanticism as a global artistic phenomenon, that is, as a period in international literary history. RAPPA comprises a full-text poetry database and ultimately, I hope, an open scholarship platform that accommodates both traditional modes of scholarly research and output and digital modes of research and publication, such as a computationally augmented analysis, visualizations, network analysis, knowledge modeling, and so on. So I'd like to spend a couple more minutes to talk more concretely about the corpora of such a resource. RAPPA assembles a full-text poetry database. There are currently 604 poets from 69 countries in RAPPA, representing roughly 40 languages, as well as a stack of tools that allows for the open-ended contextualization of these poems. In DH terms, the full-text collection of the poems itself will be a fairly traditional corpus encoded in TR-XML for reuse and long-term preservation purposes. All poems will be available in the original as well, where applicable, minimally in an English translation. The list of poets was compiled manually, drawing on a number of literary histories and reference works, such as the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. After initial attempts to source such lists from linked open data providers produced unsatisfactory results. Of course, there will always be built-in bias in such corpus, least of all its Western, Northern-centric basis of selection, which may well have been superseded on a national level. So to sum up, these are some of the aims and features of the project. I won't read out this list, but in a nutshell, Rapper conceptualizes Romanticism as a global, deeply interconnected phenomenon. It embraces a romantic Weltliteratur by bringing well and lesser-known poets, their poems and contexts from all parts of the world into conversation, and thus encourages the telling of bigger stories. This zooming out not only brings texts, authors, languages, and cultures into conversation, but also highlights the frequently non-linear modes of transmission, circulation, and reception of literature, understood here in global terms as the expression of a culture in a variety of forms. These matters will be considered alongside the conversations the texts enter into with each other directly or much more frequently indirectly. That global romanticism was abetted and fueled by increasingly global networks of publication, circulation, and translation is not a new insight, nor is the fact that the emergence of distinctive nation-states throughout the 18th and 19th century contributed to unprecedented growth in the literary marketplace and the diversification of national literary traditions. What I hope to suggest is that an effort to capture this network of contexts and relationships as manifested in acts of circulation, borrowings, translation, adaptation, and innovation, with an aim to visualizing the dynamics of an emerging global romantic period, can lead to a useful knowledge base of the period and inform new research into the field. Of course, such an endeavor poses a number of challenges, not least with regard to scale, scope, perspective, or indeed limited contextual knowledge on the subject matter. So how do I approach these challenges? I take a cue here from Ben Hutchinson, who reminds us in a quote, "To do full justice to Romanticism as a periodic category, one must de facto be a comparatist." And it turns out that comparative literary studies and digital humanities methodologies are a promising combination. The former, as it provides us with a conceptual framework for both human and machine-generated contextualizations, the latter, as it offers us tools to conduct cross-linguistic computational literary analysis. And I'll expand on both of these components later in the talk. So as I mentioned already, methodologically, Rapper sits within comparative literary studies, and a central category I employ here is that of contextuality, which was introduced by the German comparatist Angelika Corbino-Hoffmann. I'm not a comparatist by training, so I hope I won't grossly misrepresent this concept, but the main idea is that the task of contextualizing literary texts, one we engage in as literary scholars all the time, if considered as an iterative and accumulative act, can mitigate the inevitable loss of situational or intended contexts. The result of this open-ended effort of contextualization, Corbino-Hoffmann argues, transcends the linear, merely annotated text and replaces it with a spatial construct that embeds texts in a dense network of contexts and relationships that can be mapped out along historical and spatial axes, while also taking into account the theoretical and methodological origins of the contextualization effort itself. This construct of a source text with all of its context terms global text. I find this idea particularly attractive as it lends itself, I would argue, to computational methods of layering semantic annotations on various levels of granularity and abstractions onto texts. By applying digital humanities approaches, the metaphorical spatial construct of the global text can be expressed as a network of interrelated or layered annotations that feed into each other. So to sum up this section with the idea of contextuality at the back of our minds, I hope this approach will highlight that all poetry corpora are connected, as they share formal and thematic properties that form a network of relationships that we can employ the theory of the global text as a working metaphor for establishing a shared framework of points of contact on a genetic and typological basis that is based on actual intertextual relations between poems, as well as typological relations based on poetic form, subject matter, motifs, topics, and so on. And as this network of context transcends national and linguistic boundaries, the project hopes to map out these global connections by adopting DH methodologies, particularly semantic annotation and modeling approaches. So moving on from the comparative underpinnings of the approach, I would argue that the combination with digital humanities methodologies offers a promising combination to realize this contextualization effort. And in the second half of this talk, I'd like to focus on digital methods from the multilingual and digital humanities and the semantic web. So firstly, multilingual DH. A combination of machine learning and natural language processing approaches is the starting point for the detection of formal poetic features and points of contact more generally. Shared poetic genres and devices semantic features such as motifs, themes, topics, characters, and instances of intertextuality within and across literatures. In Rapper, I've begun work on multilingual translation alignment, sequence alignment for the detection of text reuse and other forms of intertextuality more generally within and across literatures, and NLP approaches, among them phonemic transcriptions, morphosyntactic annotations, and the detection of meta, rhyme, and tensaic structures. The aim is to arrive at a cross-linguistic representation of poetic form and content by using both automated processes as well as inviting user contributions. Fortunately, the study of poetry is an active field of research in the digital humanities. There are a number of language-agnostic tools as well as multilingual language models such as BERT or OpenAI's ChatGPT that offer the potential for cross-linguistic annotation, topic modeling, clustering, and alignment. Initial experiments with translation alignment, which also feeds back into the Elegy in Translations project I mentioned at the start of this talk, have proven promising and contribute towards the overall aim of facilitating large-scale semantic annotation to help establish the shared representation of the domain. Although there have been some breakthroughs in multilingual DH with regard to the application of large language models, much DH work in lesser researched and less well-funded languages and literatures remains challenging. A lack of available tools for the majority of languages, limited availability of language resources, for example, the absence of gold standard corpora, also called ground truth, that is, human verified data that can be used as a benchmark for evaluating the performance of tools, pose considerable challenges, which is why I've come to view multilingual DH as best considered a collaborative effort. It requires domain expertise and thus the possibility of user contributions, as well as the option of iterative and toolchain-based approaches where outputs become inputs, for layering annotations coming from a range of sources onto the corpora. In Rapper, I have invited input from and have sought collaboration with domain experts from various traditions, and I am hoping to recruit some potential collaborators. It is through these collaborations that I hope to address some of the main challenges of distant reading in our corpus, such as Rapper. So to sum up this section, Rapper is designed to facilitate a conversation about Romanticism as a global phenomenon expressed in the poetry of the period, by allowing us to operate within a common framework of reference. This framework is designed both to represent formal and thematic properties within national literary traditions and to trace these properties across national and linguistic boundaries. Now, there are a number of promises that multilingual DH holds, for example, the possibility to plot the results of multilingual contextualizations onto digital historical maps, enabling comparisons and connections to be drawn across the global literary canvas, including across multiple linguistic and cultural zones. It also promises increased awareness of and attention being paid to different poetic traditions and national contexts, and thus refining the knowledge graph of the global period with context-sensitive information. The key aim, of course, is the refinement of wholly automatic or semi-automatic tool chains, and last but not least, through domain expertise to arrive at better benchmarks and evaluation of the project outcomes. I'll now move on to the how, the technology that enables us to move, model, and store all of these annotation layers of contextual information we have talked about so far, namely semantic web technologies on which Rapper is built. So as I mentioned already, Rapper is designed to accommodate different levels of granularity and abstraction, from modeling individual instances of contact between poems and to connections based on poetic form and subject matter. In this section, I want to introduce the mechanisms, but also mechanisms used to facilitate the modeling of these instances in a way that hopefully not only benefits Rapper, but also related research efforts by providing a knowledge base of global romanticism as expressed in the poetry of the period. So linked open data is a way of organizing knowledge through the use of ontologies. An ontology is essentially a vocabulary that represents the concepts and properties in a particular domain in machine-readable form. The concepts and connections we want to model in Rapper range from instances of poets, poems, translators, publishers, places of birth and death or publications, dates, networks, groups of schools, magazines, collections, private papers, such as diaries or letters, on a global level, via detailed representations of individual poems, including their form and structural makeup, to the points of contact between individual poems or poets, situational contexts, intertextual relations, or classifications along rhetorical, semantic, or formal features. This shared framework provides a unified mechanism for the cross-linguistic representation of the poems, while maintaining the ability to describe them adequately within their cultures and poetic traditions. It also facilitates the modeling, equally importantly, of course, of poetic networks, circles, and schools. Thanks to their versatility, semantic web technologies, particularly in form of ontologically underpinned linked open data, have had a huge impact on DH projects over the last 20 or so years. The main benefits of an improved interoperability of data sources, the ability to interlink heterogeneous corpora from different traditions on a semantic level, has among other things mitigated the data silo phenomenon that threatens the longevity of many digital projects. Rapper in particular is really only made possible through the use of the shared framework provided by linked open data, as it is conducive to both data sharing and collaboration to enhance the data over time. So in order to facilitate the creation of a shared, formalizable representation of the global network of contexts Rapper hopes to model, 3 closely integrated ontologies are employed, and I'll conclude this section by briefly explaining their role and how they contribute towards the overall modeling task. I imagine if you have ever encountered ontologies in the context of DH projects, it might well have been this one. CDOC-CRM is a well-established and widely used top-level ontology with a number of compatible extension ontologies such as Ferber, LRM, a model for digital provenance metadata, an argumentation model, and so on. It is popular in the humanities disciplines primarily due to its ability to formally describe and integrate data from across the GLAM sector and its event-based approach to modeling, which is conducive to all historical disciplines, including, of course, literary studies. The event-based nature of the ontology is incredibly useful as it potentially allows for the attaching of contextual details indefinitely, although more realistically until you run out of money or time, or both. In Rapper, the ontology is used to model all life events, born, lived in, died, of poets, translators, or publishers, all manuscript creation or book publication events, the time, their place, and participants, circulation, translation, and reception events, time, place, participants as ascertainable from contextual sources, for example, letters, diaries, or personal papers. So it also includes the material aspects of any contextualizations. The integration with further allows us to model instances of a work, an expression, a manifestation, for example, a translation, a manifestation, the copy of a print run used for digitalization or transcription, or an individual item, a manuscript, at the appropriate level of granularity. So between 2016 and 2021, I collaborated with the ERC-funded PostData, Poetry Standardization and Linked Open Data project, through one of my other digital projects, the 18th Century Poetry Archive. The purpose of this collaboration was to make diverse corpora of poetry available online as machine-readable data, with the prospect of linking, indexing, extracting new information from this semantically linked poetry. The PostData project drew on the notion of the historical relatedness of all poetic forms, and thus the possibility of modeling connections between literatures found in formal and semantic similarities. The PostData project's main aim was to develop a conceptual standardization to build an abstract model for poetry representation based on existing philological concepts. These were taken from existing poetry projects, encoding guidelines, and corpora from different poetic traditions. PostData then translated this philosophical standardization into existing digital humanities standards in order to facilitate collaboration and the exchange of information. The main outcome was a domain-specific ontology implemented in OWL, the web ontology language, for the description of poems called ontopoetry, which allows for the interoperable representation of multilingual poetic corpora. All poems in the rapper corpus have ontopoetry representations, which encompass the poem as a whole, each of its divisions, stanzas, and lines, right down to words and punctuation characters. This modeling of each poem on a highly granular level provides the docking points for the contextualization effort outlined earlier. These docking points not only on the level of the poems, but also the poets themselves, their circles and networks, and if I don't run out of time, their papers and correspondences, also allow us to link in the analytical results from any of the tools employed in REPA I mentioned in the earlier section on multilingual DH. The third and final ontology in this complex is intro. Intro, like ontopoetry, is a domain ontology. It is designed to represent knowledge or contextuality, particularly intertextuality in literary studies, by modeling the discussion or identification of contexts in literary texts, and allows for the explicit modeling of many of the implicit steps taken when engaging in modeling intertextuality. Intro has a broad conceptualization of intertextuality, including both cultural context, sources or texts evoked by quotation or allusion, and relations between a text and a corpus, a genre, a period, or an oeuvre. For REPA, Intro's broad conceptualization of intertextuality makes it a good candidate for formally modeling the type of contextuality I outlined earlier. Intro supports vocabularies to indicate types of relationship, for example, common concepts of intertextuality, or concepts taken from genre theory, rhetoric, or intertextuality theories. If there is enough contextual information, it is even possible to model the concrete actualization of the particular literary motif, theme, or poetic form discovered. Intro is conveniently already integrated with the DocCRM, and I'm currently collaborating with its maintainer to include the web annotation framework model to facilitate modeling in the digital realm. For example, cross-medial annotations between textual representations, facsimiles, or spoken recordings of the poems. I should also mention briefly that by virtue of the integrated nature, the ontologies have built-in certainty measures which can draw and control vocabularies that introduces a common framework for expressing uncertainty in the project. Although not currently implemented, there is also the possibility to use CRM's argumentation model, which provides a mechanism to bring different, even conflicting assertions into the mix, as it both facilitates detailed attribution of the inclusion of the underlying evidence or reasoning processes that led to a certain assertion. So the final principle of the formal modeling exercise I have outlined is that of vocabularies. You may have heard of SCOS. Vocabulary is the simple knowledge organization system, which is designed for the representation of thesauri, classification schemes, taxonomies, subject heading systems, and other types of structured controlled vocabularies. In RAPA, SCOS vocabularies are employed whenever possible. For example, for classes such as the types of contextual relationships or architectural entities such as discipline, discourse, period, genre, movement, over a school, or geographically and temporally defined architects. In addition to well-established linked open data providers such as VIAF, Wikidata, or National Library resources, I'm also in the process of creating SCOS vocabularies, particularly for use in RAPA, including but not limited to poetic form, lexica of poetic literary symbols, motifs, themes, and topics from a number of pertinent publication sources. So to conclude this section, let me summarize by reiterating some of the key points. The main purpose of the ontological representation of all poems in RAPA is to provide a unified mechanism of representing and encoding poetic phenomena, to establish docking points for contextualizations of any type on the appropriate level of granularity, to link in any of the analytical results from the tools employed in RAPA, but equally to accommodate expert contributions, and lastly to facilitate the unified management, querying, and publication of the annotated poetic corpora for reuse and further inquiry, be it as downloadable dumps of the entire graph or by querying it using query language such as Sparkle. The aim here is really through publication of the RAPA knowledge base, not only to facilitate interoperability with other projects, but to enable data federation to make more sophisticated semantic queries possible. I hope what has been suggested, if not shown, is that through the layering of semantic annotations from external factors such as the circumstances of the composition and production, publication and circulation of poems, right through the individual instances of connections, be it on the level of the poem as a whole, its genre, form, or subject matter, or indeed connections attached to a single stanza, line, or word, the system facilitates not only the context-sensitive modeling of the type of contextualization, but might eventually allow us to zero in on the functions, or rather work that is performed by it as the network evolves and matures. So this brings me very briefly to the final part of this talk, in which I want to briefly introduce the current home for RAPA, as well as suggest some of the ongoing and future work for the project. So RAPA is underpinned by an infrastructure project called Prisms. Prisms is a digital scholarly editions publication platform that is built on semantic web technologies. It allows editors of scholarly editions to arrange and publish the materials underlying their editions and link it to the edited text. It also allows users of the edition to create new links to other texts, additional resources, secondary literature, as well as to query the Prisms graph through a Sparkle endpoint that offers a number of visualization options of the underlying data. While not explicitly designed for the publication and querying of the RAPA model, by exposing and visualizing its data, my current focus is to work towards exposing the rich layered network of annotations in RAPA in a user interface. In addition to what I've already outlined, this interface will also allow users to add new contexts by flexibly attaching, that is, importing context sources, categorizing them, and defining their functions as precisely as possible, drawing on the ontologies and vocabularies I introduced earlier. The resulting knowledge graph on the poetry of the global Romantic period will be published on the Prisms platform, which provides the required graph database and query dissemination options. So to wrap things up, I just some of the future work in the Rapper project. I'm particularly excited to start experimenting with visualizations of poetic networks, including social networks or heat maps of clusters as they emerge along a variety of properties I hope to identify globally as constituent of the global romantic model. I'm also keen to employ spatio-temporal tools in an attempt to more closely integrate the historical and geographical components of the model through integration on platforms such as Open Historical Map, which may reveal interesting patterns of formation and observe their development into interregional and national networks. I'm also interested in using network analytical measures to relate national literary traditions within the global literary landscape of the period. Finally, I'd also love to explore potential pedagogical applications in teaching the global Romantic period. So, to finish, if you go to the website romanticperiodpoetry.org at the moment, you will see that a map is used as a basic visualization access point. But ultimately, I hope to expand this type of visualization to include historical maps of poetic forms of context, passive transmission, circulation, and exchange that highlight the connectedness of Romantic period poetic traditions. The Rapper project thus aims to contribute to the linked open data cloud on global romanticism. With the help of some of the DH methods discussed in this talk, I hope that we can expand our view of national and European romanticism with a networked global one. Thank you very much.